the class, and we'll go back to the previous discussions a bit because many of you perhaps would not be able to note what we tried to suggest in the last class. So we were discussing post-colonialism, and this is from the paper Post-Colonial Literatures. This is the background that we are trying to suggest. Okay, and we first tried to see what is the origin of the term, and we could find out that the origin lies over here. The term colonia is the origin, which actually means settlement or farm. Okay, and it refers to the Roman Empire when Roman citizens used to migrate from their place, and they would yes, sure. So I think it would be better if we yes, I guess if now it's better to see the screen. Yes, so you can see that the Romans, when they settled from away from their native lands and settled somewhere else, uh, and yet they retained their earlier citizenship. Okay. That time, you can say that they were actually colonizing. They were trying to establish colonies. Okay. So this word colonia used to refer to the Romans who settled outside their native lands but remained Roman citizens. Okay, that would be the idea of colony, right? And what is the most important thing regarding colonialism and colonization? We'll come back to colonialism later. Though the initial question is what is colonialism, we will come back to this question later after understanding what is colonization and what is settlement and then what is colonialism. And then we will move towards post-colonialism, post-colonial theory, post-colonial criticism. So it traps the settlers and colonists, the native inhabitants, and the settlers who go there in a very tumultuous, traumatic relationship. Okay. So settlement is an act of establishing colonies. Colony is a body of people who settle far from home but maintain their ties with their homeland. Those of you who have missed these points, please take snapshots of these things or keep a note of it so that you can refer to this later on. These are all very, very basic things that you would require to understand the paper and other things that are there in the literature that is suggested in the paper. And we are not going to repeat them in the class time and again. So we have started at a very basic level. We are not going to go back. Okay. So the colonial encounter initiates the process of forming a colony. Okay, so it's the formation of a colony that we have over here in the new land. A new community gets built up. A new community emerges, right? And this necessarily means that there would be reforming. It's not reforming. It's reforming and unforming of colonies, unforming of communities. Okay, that existed there. So previous communities that existed there would be again undergoing several processes where there would be fundamental changes within their matrix, within their very nature of the colony. The identities of the people would change, and you already know that post-colonialism is mostly about identity. Okay, so this actually involves a wide range of practices that includes trade, plunder, negotiation, warfare, genocide, enslavement, rebellions. We could understand these terms separately in the previous classes. Hopefully, you know them. And colonialism can be defined as the conquest and control of other people's lands and goods. This is one kind of definition that you can think of regarding colonialism. Okay, it deals with the conquest and control of other people's lands and goods. Okay, and such practices generated and were shaped by a variety of writings. So, controlling other people's resources not only entails economic control, not only entails political control, but there is also certain cultural affairs, certain signifying practices, certain writings, certain discourses, documents, which also play a huge role. So, public private records, letters, trade documents, government papers, and scientific literature. Along with these things, we have fiction as well, fiction, poetry, drama, and several other literary works. Okay, so these practices and writings are what contemporary studies of colonialism and post-colonialism try to make sense of. They try to see how this exploitative network worked, which is actually running under colonialism. This exploitative network, this economic exploitation, how does it work? Okay, so colonialism is a recurrent and widespread phenomenon of human history. There have been colonialisms before, there have been colonizations before British Empire. British came to India, say for instance, if you take our example, they came to India, they colonized us, but several people went away from their native land and settled somewhere else. Okay, you can think of these examples. You can think of course, the Roman Empire stretching from Armenia to the Atlantic. Then you can, of course, think of Genghis Khan in the 13th century when the Mongols conquered the Middle East as well as China. Okay, then you can think of the Aztec Empire as well. Okay, that was established from 14th to the 16th century. So one of the various ethnic groups who settled in the Valley of Mexico subjugated the others. During that time, Aztec Empire was built, and in the 15th century, various kingdoms in southern India they also came under the control of Vijayanagar Empire. So empires were there even long before British colonization occurred. Okay. But then there is a marked difference between modern European colonization and the previous colonizations. Okay. So modern European powers established colonies in Asia and Africa, and this changed the history of humankind in an unprecedented way. So hence post-colonial studies that we are doing, that we are going to do in this semester, actually is concerned with with this conquest of Europe initiated by Europeans. Not all Europeans. Do not go into those broader generalizations that Europe suddenly started walking and then they colonized Asia and then they colonized Africa. Europe means here we are referring to certain European powers, as we noted in the previous classes that like Germany was there, UK was there, France was there, Spain was there. So there are uh, places in Europe where people still live and they never colonized other communities. In fact, they were often subject to colonization by other European powers, by fellow Europeans. That also happened in several cases. Remember when we read the history of modern British novel, the early 20th century history in the fourth semester. So there we talked about the Irish rebellion, Irish revolution. So Ireland was a British colony for a long time, and it was only in the beginning of the 20th century they got independence. So it's not that all the European powers were actually doing this, but yes, Europe was the center where profit was flowing, where the controlling center was there, and they were controlling the rest of the colonies. Okay, so that is how it was happening. So modern colonialism did more than extracting tributes, goods, wealth from other countries and where it conquered. It actually restructured the economies of the conquered countries, drawing them into a complex relationship with their own, so that there was a flow of human and natural resources between colonized and colonial countries. Okay, so it initiated a new history, it initiated a new humankind altogether, which actually ensured that history, that new humankind, that new human mechanism, that system that it generated, the historical events that it actually ushered in, those events, those historical structures actually ensured that always the profit would flow to the capital. Okay, and human resource, natural resource would always be there, always travel towards the colonial countries, and the colonies would suffer. Okay, the resources would go to the metropolitan center, and the colonies would suffer. So that's how it altered history. Now, when we are talking about resources, we have to talk about capital because there's a connection between colonialism and capitalism. You try to understand this connection. Now, we have already talked about this, that there were slaves, indentured laborers, as well as raw materials which were transported from the colonies to manufacture goods in the metropolis or in other locations for metropolitan consumption. We talked how Manchester flourished in UK, and we also talked about Aga Shahid Ali's poem Dhaka Gauzes, where he says that how the looms of Bengal were silenced, right? And how cotton shipped draw to England, and that's how entire culture of cloth production, entire economy of Bengal suffered because of that. Right? Similar kinds of thing happened perhaps in a greater scale in Africa, where human beings were taken forcefully and they were transported to America. And there the plantations were growing, and these people were enslaved and were made or forced to work in plantations without any kind of reason. So the colonies also provide markets. So on the one hand, there were raw materials which were collected from the colonies. On the other hand, the finished products needed to be sold in some places. So colonies provided the market as well. So the slaves were moved from Africa to the Americas, and in the West, Indian plantations, they produced sugar for consumption in Europe, and raw cotton was moved from India to be manufactured into cloth in England and then sold back to India, whose own cloth production suffered a lot because of this. And in whichever direction actually human beings went, okay, be it towards the metropolis, the colonial metropolis, or to the colonies, always profit would flow back to the quote unquote mother country. Okay, that was the system. So to understand this, we have to make sure that we know the meaning of another word called imperialism. Okay, imperialism. So Oxford English Dictionary defines imperial as pertaining to empire, but for us the meaning is not so simple. Okay, it does not always mean that it has to do with the emperor or the king. Okay, so imperialism has a larger connotation. So when we are talking about imperialism, we have to mention this book. I talked about this book briefly, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. And there Lenin is talking about the growth of finance capital and industry in the Western countries. That actually created an enormous amount of superabundance. Remember, we were talking about occupying an island in the last class, perhaps, that if you suppose you are a capitalist and you own an island, and there are very few people, but you have lots and lots of resources, you have a lot of money, but you can't do anything actually. You cannot make four people work harder and harder day in and day out, day and night, and build an empire or build a great factory. For that, you need more labor, right? So there is another island where perhaps there are plenty of people living, but there is no capital, there is no other resources. So you fetch people from there, you take them to your island, and you make them work. And this is how you actually uh, create a system which is always growing. Why? Because you're constantly producing things, and then the production would go to a higher scale, and there would be plenty of goods. So at that moment, you require market as well. So what you will do, you will again go to their island, that island which is adjacent to your island, where plenty of people are starving. Perhaps you will sell them the goods that you have made in your island. Okay, and you are going to sell them, and they are going to be the consumers. And in this way, again, you have to produce goods. So this is how the flow of capital would always go on and on and on. It would never end. So this was precisely the moment when this was precisely what happened in Europe. Okay, this was the moment that actually made Europeans go away from their land. That is actually the logic behind this entire idea of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Okay, so capitalism would reach its highest level and it would go imperial. That would be the idea, actually. So therefore, it needed more to move out. So capitalism reached its highest level. It had to move out. It moved out and subordinated the non-industrialized countries. Just now we were saying this thing. So in due course, the rest of the world would be absorbed by European finance capitalists. So this would be the idea. Okay, and this very global system was known as imperialism, and it constituted a particular stage of capitalist development, the highest in Lenin's understanding, because rivalry between the various imperial wars would catalyze their destruction and the demise of capitalism. So that would be the idea of communism, that ultimately communism would usher in. Ultimately, the entire society, the entire world would usher in socialism and communism. Phase wise, it would go. So capitalism would wither away, right? So it is this definition that allows some people to argue that capitalism is the distinguishing feature between colonialism and imperialism. Yes, colonialism begins, and imperialism is all about capitalism. So this would be the this would be one theory. So direct colonial rule is not necessary for imperialism that we know in this sense, and because the economic and social relations of dependency and control ensure both captive labor as well as markets for European industry as well as goods. So direct dependency, direct control is not necessary. And sometimes words like new imperialism, neo colonialism are also used to describe these situations. In as much as the growth of European industry and finance capital was achieved through colonial domination in the first place, we can also see that imperialism is the highest stage of colonialism. So colonialism begins, and then gradually, as capitalism grows bigger and bigger, okay, we have the highest phase of capitalism, and we have the highest phase of colonialism as well in the form of imperialism. Okay, that was the that is one logic actually. So in the modern world, then we can distinguish between colonization as the takeover of territory, appropriation of material resources, exploitation of labor, and also interference with political and cultural structure of another territory or nation. And imperialism is the global system. Okay, so that imperialism is the highest phase of colonialism. This particular idea indicates that there is a temporal distinction between colonialism and imperialism. So first there would be colonialism, then there would be imperialism. As capitalism would grow, imperialism would come into place. Okay, if we think of spatial distinction, which is more widely accepted, we can say that imperialism or neo-imperialism is the phenomenon that originates in the metropolis. Okay, so imperialism was already there. Theory 2, we are saying now, we are discussing now. First theory is that first there is colonialism, then imperialism took place. Second theory says that, well, imperialism was already there in the metropolis. Okay, the process which leads to domination and control was already there, and its result, or what happens in the colonies as a consequence of that, is actually called colonialism or neo-colonialism. Right? So therefore, colonialism is basically a subset of imperialism. Right? So in the imperial country is the metropole from which power flows, and the colony or neo-colony is the place which it penetrates and controls. Imperialism can function without formal colonies, as you can see in the case of United States of America, and some people would say China in these days. Okay. But colonialism cannot function uh, without physical control, without in-person control. Okay. So there lies the distinction. But this is the distinction that Edward Said also makes in Orientalism. There are two very important books written by Edward Said that I told you. One is Orientalism, another is Culture and Imperialism. Okay. There's Said writes, imperialism means the practice, the theory. Notice the words which he is using. The practice, that means what you do physically. The theory, what you think, what you write about. These are all part of theory, right? And the attitudes as well. What kind of attitude you are having towards economic control? You are having what kind of attitude towards the people that you are colonizing, or perhaps meeting, or perhaps knowing about. Okay, so attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory. Okay, that is imperialism. Imperialism is not something that is there, out there. We can see that, touch that. Imperialism is something that is not tangible in nature. Imperialism is actually referring to whole body of practice, theory, and attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center. So Said and other post-colonial thinkers would argue that this attitude, this culture, okay, this mindset was already there, right, as a discourse. Though I haven't talked about this word discourse in your class till date, we would do it soon. We would talk about discourse very soon, perhaps in this class or maybe subsequently. What is the meaning of discourse? Then it would be clearer to you. Okay, so when we say imperialism, when we say capitalism, when we say colonialism, we are actually talking about a discourse. Okay, what is a discourse? We will go to that later in a few moments, perhaps. So basically, Said is saying imperialism is a practice, a theory, and attitude of a metropolitan center. So metropolitan center is having an attitude, a mindset that we are superior. Okay, we can govern others. This is the origin of imperialism, and imperialism would always be there. So we can have all kinds of legitimate rights to establish colonies, to exploit, control other people. বুঝতে পারলাম যে ইম্পিরিয়ালিজম হচ্ছে একটা অ্যাটিটিউড যেটা তোমার মধ্যে আগে থেকে আছে, তাই তুমি যাচ্ছ বাইরে, এবং কখনো না গিয়েও তুমি তুমি লোকের আহ, জিনিসপত্রের উপর, তাদের তাদের দেশের উপর কন্ট্রোল করতে পারছো, না গিয়েও হতে পারে সেটা। হ্যাঁ, এই সুপিরিয়রিটিটা, এই সেন্স অফ সুপিরিয়রিটিটার একটা নাম হচ্ছে ইম্পিরিয়ালিজম। তুমি ইম্পিরিয়ালিজম কেন বলছো এটাকে, এটা সুপিরিয়রিটি কেন বলছে না? ইম্পিরিয়ালিজম এই জন্য বলছে যে এটা এতটাই একটা বড় একটা ফিলিং, এতটাই একটা স্ট্রং ফিলিং, যে আমি ডেলিভারিটলি খুব সিম্পলিফাইড, ওভার সিম্পলিফাইড ওয়েতে বলছি কথাগুলো, কারণ তোমরা এখনো ডিসকোর্স বা অন্যান্য কথাগুলো মানে জানো না। তো ফিলিং বলে ধরো। এবার এমনই একটা ফিলিং যেটাতে মনে হচ্ছে যে আমাদের পুরো রাইট আছে অন্যদের উপর কবজা করে নেওয়ার, বুঝতে পেরেছো? We have all the rights to control other people and we can build up our empire. এই রাইটটা শুধু ভাবলেই হবে না। কেউ ধরো ভাবছে আমি সবার থেকে সুপিরিয়র, সেটা তো তার একটা সুপিরিয়রিটি কমপ্লেক্স হচ্ছে। কিন্তু ইম্পিরিয়ালিজম কখন হবে? যখন সে সত্যি সত্যি এম্পায়ার বিল্ড করার কথা ভাববে ওই সুপিরিয়রিটি কমপ্লেক্সটা থেকে। তো রেশিয়ালি we are superior, hence we can control, and hence we will control, and there the things start, actually the ball starts rolling. ওকে, সো ওখান থেকে একটা কনসিকোয়েন্স হচ্ছে colonialism, colonization হচ্ছে সেখানে, whatever is happening in the colonies is actually under the domain of colonialism, বুঝতে পেরেছো? তো এই কথা সাইদও বলছেন, colonialism which is almost always a consequence of imperialism, it's a consequence of imperialism, is implanting of settlements on distant territory. Okay, so the very fact that European post-Renaissance colonial expansion was coterminous with the development of a modern capitalist system of economic exchange meant that the perception of the colonies as primarily established to provide raw materials for the burgeoning economies of the colonial powers was greatly strengthened and institutionalized. Okay, so that was one kind of testimony that tells us that, well, how could these two be coterminous? কি করে একসাথে যেতে পারে? পোস্ট রেনেসা যে একটা কলোনিয়াল এক্সপ্যানশন হচ্ছে, ওই সময় থেকে তো শুরু হচ্ছে, তাদের শিপ বিল্ডিং হচ্ছে, আমরা পড়েছিলাম না, নেভিগেশনে উন্নতি করছে ওরা, ওরা বিভিন্ন জায়গায় যাচ্ছে, ওদের নবজাগরণ হচ্ছে, জগৎটাকে জানতে পারছে, বাইরের জগতে যাচ্ছে, প্রচুর শিপ বিল্ড করে করে তারা সি ভয়েজেসে বেরোচ্ছে ইংরেজরা। এই পুরো গল্পটা দেখো, it actually coincides with the development of modern capitalism. হুম, সেখান থেকে প্রোটো মিডল ক্লাস, সেখান থেকে তারপর আস্তে আস্তে সত্যি সত্যি মিডল ক্লাসের ইমার্জেন্স হচ্ছে, এবং তারপর ক্যাপিটালিজম আসছে। তারপরে যেতে যেতে 19th সেঞ্চুরিতে ক্যাপিটালিস্ট ইকোনমি হয়ে যাচ্ছে অলমোস্ট ইংল্যান্ড, তাই না? আগ্রেরিয়ান ইকোনমি থেকে ক্যাপিটালিস্ট ইকোনমিতে ট্রান্সফর্ম করে যাচ্ছে। ইতিমধ্যে নভেল একটা জনরা তৈরি হয়ে যাচ্ছে, তাই না? তোমরা আগের বার পড়েছিলে যে আগের সেমিস্টারে বোধহয়, যে ওই হাউ রাইজ অফ দ্য নভেল, না সেকেন্ড সেমিস্টারে পড়েছি, আগের সেমিস্টারে না সেকেন্ডে পড়েছি রাইজ অফ দ্য নভেল। তো নভেল হচ্ছে একটা মিডল ক্লাস জনরা, একটা পুরো নতুন জনরা চলে আসছে নভেলের, একটা নতুন ক্লাস আসার সাথে সাথে। তো এই পুরো জিনিসটাই দেখো, ইট ইজ কোটারমিনাস উইথ the colonial expansion, and this is not a coincidence. Okay, there are connections between these two things, the rise of the middle class and the rise of imperialism actually went hand in hand, and they are coterminous. Okay, so that's why it is said that this very idea gets strengthened, that actually the colonies, the rest of the world, is there to provide and feed and assist, okay, and serve the West. এই আইডিয়াটা আগে থেকেই ছিল, এই আইডিয়াটাই হচ্ছে সূত্রপাত ঘটাচ্ছে colonization and colonialism। This is the idea that actually uh, starts, kicks off the idea of colonization, right? So it is also meant that the relation between the colonizer and colonized was locked into a rigid hierarchy of difference, which is deeply resistant to fair and equitable exchanges, whether economic, cultural, or social. Okay, so always there would be a hierarchy of difference, right? The colonized would never think himself or herself as a human being. He or she would always think that I am inferior to the master, I am a slave, I am perhaps having no identity at all if the master doesn't give me one. Okay, so the classic case of Crusoe and Friday. So that's why I told you when we dealt with Robinson Crusoe that Robinson Crusoe is a wonderful, fantastic colonial fantasy, right? So imperialism in its more recent sense is about the acquisition of an empire of overseas colonies, and it is associated with the Europeanization of the globe. We have discussed this idea of Europeanization of the globe, where you take the perspective of the Europeans, you look through their looking glass, through their eyes. Okay, so there are three phases of this. One is the age of discovery during the 15th and 16th century, and this is the time when Renaissance is happening. Remember, in terms of England, that the history of Renaissance that we read, and then we have the age of mercantilism during the 17th and 18th centuries, when the merchants are coming and England is becoming a bourgeois economy, okay, a capitalist economy, and then the age of imperialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, okay, where the empire, where several countries across Asia and Africa are getting their independence, but still they are dependent upon the West. Okay, so there remains an enormous ambiguity between the economic and political connotations of the word imperialism. If imperialism is defined as a political system in which an imperial center governs colonized countries, then the granting of political independence signals the end of empire, the collapse of imperialism. Okay, so with the political decolonization happening on a particular date, can we say that imperialism ends there? Can we say that the imperialism has ended? The dominance of the metropolitan center ends there? We cannot say that. We were discussing it in detail that in today's world also we are thinking of going abroad. We are thinking of serving them. We are thinking of uh, seeing ourselves in their countries. Okay, so that we can perceive so that we can perceive ourselves as human beings, as successful human beings, because we think that opportunities lies over there, and many people would argue that it's rightfully so. So if imperialism is primarily an economic system of penetration and control of market, then political changes do not basically affect it, and may even redefine the term, as in the case of American imperialism, which wields enormous military and economic power across the globe but without direct political control. So that is why imperialism has to pay heed, one has to pay heed to the nexus among economy, politics, culture, when it comes to defining imperialism. So imperialism is not merely about who controls our country directly, who rules over us. Because we have seen that when there are no rulers, no British rulers, we are being ruled by our fellow Indians, we still are getting dominated, we still are getting exploited, we still are under the under the spell of imperialism, we still cannot function independently. True independence has not taken place yet. Okay, so ultimately it was the control of the means of representation rather than the means of production that confirmed the hegemony of European powers. That's a very important word that we need to uh, take into account: hegemony. Okay, hegemony means, but it's a Gramscian concept. It comes from Antonio Gramsci's idea. So hegemony means complete control. Now, how can you establish hegemony or complete control? When you not only work through force, but also you work through consent. You build up a consent. You try to develop a consent that if you do not rule over someone, right, that person would go on completely, go on completely get ruined, completely get into a place which is beyond recovery. Okay, that person needs your tutelage. That person needs your guidance. That person needs your rule. Only then he or she can function as human being. If you can build that, build this mindset inside someone's mind, then the rule would be foolproof. There won't be any kind of issues at all, right? So this is hegemony. Hegemony then means coercion. Coercion means when you are applying force, and consent building. Consent building means you are actually giving your consent. You are agreeing to the oppressor that yes, you are to be controlled. Right. So you are actually giving your consent. You are saying yes, fine, control over me. Right. Have rule over me. Have control over my economic resources. So this is only possible when you are not only controlling or directly controlling the means of production, but actually you are controlling the means of representation. What is the means of representation and how it is going to affect you? See, means of representation means how you see yourself. What is the process of seeing oneself? You can only read about yourself. You can only think about yourself through certain discourses, through certain ideas which are available to you. So if these ideas are getting manipulated, then you would be only seeing your image as it would be shown to you, right? So if someone controls the way in which you see yourself in front of a mirror, right? If someone controls that, then you are only getting that person's image of yourself, not your actual image. This is precisely how the means of representation gets controlled, right? And if that is the case, then if the person who is controlling your image would be presenting you in an inferior way and presenting himself in a superior way, superior to you, more powerful to you, more powerful than you, then you are surely giving consent. That yes, I need that tutelage. I am unable to control my my resources, my ideas, my feelings, my thoughts. I am irrational. I am not rational like that. Okay, so you are going to think yourself in terms of these binaries. Okay, so economic, political, and military dominance enabled this dissemination of European ideas through the powerful agencies of education and publishing. So means of production gets controlled, means of representation gets controlled only when you have control over education and publishing. Okay, what you are reading, how you are being educated. Right? So schools and colleges are not innocent places or apolitical places. But it was the power of imperial discourse rather than military or economic might that confirmed the hegemony of imperialism in the late 19th century. So everywhere there was no direct political control. Everywhere there were no force which were applied. Sometimes it was, or most of the time, it was discourse. It was the cultural mappings. It was the cultural constructs that actually condition minds. And in 1914, the age of classical imperialism, by that time, the age of classical imperialism had to come to an end, and yet we would see that by this time imperialism had demonstrated its protean nature. So the previous imperialism, the classical imperialism, where the emperor would go invade another place and control that place, that time was over. New kind of imperialism has occurred, which has a very protean nature, its ability to change centers, to adapt to the changing dynamic of the world power, and ultimately to develop into globalism. And arguably its natural successor in the globalism was the natural successor of imperialism in the late 20th century. Okay, so at the turn of the 20th century, parts of Africa, Asia, Australasia, Canada, the Caribbean, and Ireland were under British Empire. By the mid 20th century, we see decolonization of millions of people with the collapse of the British Empire. Okay. But the, if the political realities of empire have been transformed into the coming of with the coming of independent government to many once colonized locations, the material and imaginative legacies of both colonialism and decolonization remain fundamentally important constitutive elements in the contemporary world. So these legacies continue even when there are no empires, even when there are no explicit ruling or rulers. Rulers have departed to their country. Okay. Even then also we would find that the legacy of colonization still remains. Okay. So these legacies continue to inflect contemporary geopolitical realities and conflicts around the world and impact upon how different people are forced to live today. Okay, think of Africa. We were talking about the Berlin Conference, remember? In the last class, 1884 Berlin Conference, where Africa was divided into several places. Okay, how much time do we have? Do we have double period or single period today? Single period, okay. So I think we can begin a new discussion in the next class. We will put an end to this today, okay? That would be better. So we in the next class we are going to start with the emergence of post-colonialism.